I was painting tiny gold crescent moons on my 8-year-old's fingernails with a fine tip brush when my phone buzzed with 41 unread alerts. My daughter, Lily, held her hand perfectly still, whispering that ours was the best party in the entire valley, even though it was just the two of us and a simple tart from the corner bakery. Then I saw the pinned message from my mother, sitting at the top of our family group chat like a cold headstone. She had invited the whole family to her 70th birthday gala. Everyone except me and Lily. I didn't reply. But 3 weeks later, at that very celebration, my mother would open her mouth to speak to me, and not a single sound would come out. Here is what none of them knew was already in motion. They called me the unsuccessful one. They simply forgot who keeps the books. Welcome back to their secret stories, where quiet women set loud boundaries and pride meets the truth it's been dodging. I'm Fiona, 35, a single mother and the financial investigator nobody in my family ever bothered to thank. If a family that measures your worth by your tax bracket has ever left you off the guest list, pull up a chair. This story is for you. Drop a comment with your thoughts and make sure to subscribe so you never miss a quiet reckoning. The message wasn't an accident. My mother, Helena Thorne, had composed it slowly, deliberately, the way she did everything designed to leave a mark. She wrote that she wanted her 70th milestone to be shared only by the children who had made her proud. Then she listed them: my brother Tristan, my sister Audrey, their spouses, their children, the neighbors, the local pastor. And then, ensuring no one could misunderstand, she added the line she'd been waiting years to put into print. Every one of my children made me proud, she wrote, except Fiona, who chose the path of an unstable single mother. My sister, Audrey, was the first to react. She tapped a little heart onto the sentence, sealing it like a period. Nobody argued. Nobody typed a single word in my defense. I watched the 3 gray dots appear and vanish from a dozen relatives who had sat at my dining table. I set the phone face down on the cushions. Lily asked if I liked her gold moons, and I told her they were the finest nails in the entire county. I meant it. Arguing with Helena Thorne was like auditing a firm that had already burned its ledgers. You could be correct down to the very last decimal point and still walk away with nothing but ink stains on your fingers. So I chose silence. I capped the gold paint. I finished the tart. I let the phone vibrate itself to sleep on the sofa while my daughter told me a long, serious story about a wild rabbit she had spotted near the schoolyard. Some people spend their entire lives waiting to be chosen by the ones who never will. I'd stopped waiting a long time ago. What I hadn't stopped doing was paying attention. And attention, as it turns out, keeps far better records than any group chat. By 6 the next morning, I was unlocking the glass door of Thorne Forensic, an advisory, my single-room office located above the vintage bookstore on Spruce Street. I brewed the coffee. I switched on the small radiator that had never once managed to warm the room. 3 clients. That was my entire world some weeks. And I understood every dollar that flowed through those small businesses the way I knew the sound of Lily's breathing in the dark. I built this practice the hard way. I earned my credentials by studying at my kitchen table long after midnight. A baby monitor static, hissing beside my textbooks, my ex-husband already halfway out the door. People in my family liked to say I had chosen the difficult road as if a smooth one had ever been laid out for me. What they never brought up was the spring 4 years ago when Audrey's boutique florist business nearly collapsed. She had tangled her personal bills with her vendor accounts until the entire ledger was a knot no one could untangle. I untangled it. I sat at her dining table for 2 full weekends and dragged her out of a financial crater that would have ruined her credit for a decade. She thanked me by never speaking of it again. That was our family arithmetic. My assistance dissolved the moment it was rendered, while my perceived shortcomings were etched in granite. I didn't mind the quiet anymore. The quiet was where I did my cleanest work. But that morning, wiping the condensation off the glass, I felt an uneasy pressure. A name had begun appearing in my mother's casual remarks Marcus. And in my professional experience, when a man who deals in grand promises starts handling your mother's inheritance, you don't wait for the quarterly statement to arrive. Lily waited until bath night to bring it up. She was warm, pruned, and constructing a fortress out of bubbles when she looked up, her expression entirely plain. "Mom, why aren't we going to Grandma's gala?" I could have fabricated a story. I could have told her we had other plans. That adults have complicated arrangements, that her grandmother loved her deeply. Instead, I sat on the cold bathroom tile and gave her the honest, gentle version. The one that didn't force her to carry my mother's resentment in her small chest. I explained that sometimes people decide there is only room at the table for a specific kind of family, and that our small family didn't fit their portrait. She considered this, her chin tucked in deep thought. Then she asked the question that would follow me all the way to the country club ballroom. "Grandma." I wiped a dollop of foam from her cheek. "We are the realest thing I have," I said, and the words settled with absolute weight between us. She nodded, like a judge closing a folder. Then she announced that we would throw our own party, far better than Grandma's, down by the orchard with a homemade cake, and that I was officially invited because I was real family. I told her I would be honored. Later, after she had drifted off, I stood in her bedroom doorway far longer than necessary. My mother had spent 70 years mastering the art of shutting people out. My daughter had spent 8 years deciding who belonged. I knew exactly which one of them I wanted to emulate. And I knew, standing there, that whatever happened next, the one thing I would never permit again was for my child to feel like a visitor in her own bloodline. 2 days later, I drove across town to return a vintage crystal vase I'd been meaning to drop off, and to view the estate one last time before the grand celebration. The Thorne house sat at the end of Blackwood Drive, a structure of heavy timber and deep stone arches, every beam of it raised by my father's own hands. William Thorne had built that home the year he retired from his engineering firm, and he built it to outlast us all. It was my mother's entire kingdom now. It was where every holiday occurred, every milestone portrait was captured, every casket was carried down the wide steps. She met me on the porch and didn't offer to let me inside. She was in the middle of planning the logistics. The grand ballroom at the Grandview Manor, the professional string quartet, the gourmet caterer she'd hired from the city, 70 guests, a custom gown the color of deep emerald. She spoke to me the way one speaks to a courier. Curt, her gaze scanning the driveway over my shoulder. I handed her the vase. She took it and while rubbing an imaginary blemish off the glass, she uttered the phrase that turned my blood cold. Marcus is managing all of my accounts now. He's freed up so much capital. He is incredibly sharp. She said it with the casual pride of a woman describing a high-end appliance. I asked, keeping my voice entirely neutral, exactly how much capital he had freed up. She waved her hand dismissively. Finances aren't really your specialty, are they, dear? I let the comment pass, but driving home, I ran the numbers. I couldn't help it. A retired widow, an extravagant gala. A son-in-law who had never encountered a dollar he didn't spend twice. The columns simply didn't balance. And my mother had just handed the ledger to the one man in the family who couldn't balance a checkbook. Marcus Sterling had married my sister, Audrey, 11 years ago in a garden ceremony that cost more than my entire college tuition. He was a land developer, or so he styled himself, the type who arrived at family dinners in a luxury SUV with dealer plates still attached, spinning tales about a massive commercial project that was always on the verge of breaking ground. Lately, his story was Blackwood Heights, a high-end subdivision he claimed would transform the local economy. He'd been pitching it at every dinner table that would have him. My sister sat beside him, smiling like a woman, trying to keep a house of cards upright in a gale. Audrey had always required a flawless presentation. The marriage, the children in designer sweaters, the absolute assurance that she had partnered with the winning man. I had stopped believing in that presentation around the same time I stopped being invited to stand in it. When I crossed paths with them at the local market, Marcus clapped my shoulder and informed me he'd been streamlining Helena's entire financial structure, consolidating older accounts into much higher yielding positions. I asked, keeping the tone light, if I might review the documentation sometime, purely as a professional courtesy. His smile remained fixed, but his eyes grew cold. You're not the only person in this family who understands how money works, Fiona, he said. Audrey laughed a bit too quickly and guided him toward the registers. I stood in the aisle and felt the discrepancy grow larger. Marcus had been telling his development stories for over a decade. And for over a decade, I had let them pass because a man's tall tales are his own concern, right up until the day he begins underwriting them with my mother's security. Until that afternoon, he had never touched a penny of her estate, and I had no legal authority to audit my brother-in-law. That had just changed. Men like Marcus don't streamline. They siphon slowly with a polished smile, and they always target the individual least likely to scrutinize the statements. My mother trusted him because he flattered her. My sister trusted him because the alternative was too terrifying to face. And I was the only one holding a calculator, standing outside a locked door, listening to the foundation being quietly dismantled. I didn't let it rest. That very week, I called my mother, not to argue, but to plant a single warning where she couldn't ignore it. Mum, please do not sign any documents for Marcus until I've had a chance to read them. That is all I'm asking. There was a long silence on the line. In the quiet, I heard the crisp rustle of a page turning. Some newspaper puzzle she was working on to demonstrate my insignificance. It's already finalized, she said, and it is none of your concern. I asked her, as calmly as possible, what exactly was finalized? She told me Marcus had consolidated her assets weeks ago. She'd signed the paperwork at his dining table. A home equity line of credit had been secured against the house to put her equity to work. A helo key on my father's house. I felt the ground shift under my feet. I told her she needed to terminate it immediately, that we could sit down together, and I would help her raid every paragraph. She replied that the funds had already been transferred into Marcus's project, that it was far too late to behave like a paranoid old woman, and that William would be deeply disappointed by how little faith I had in our family. Then she hung up. I sat with the cold phone in my hand, a grim reality setting in. I couldn't freeze a single account. It wasn't my name on the title. It wasn't my signature. She was a legally competent adult, and I had no standing to intervene. By the time I could secure any sort of legal authority, the funds would be entirely gone. She had been cautioned. She had chosen her crossword puzzle. All I could do now was what I had always done when someone I cared about walked toward a cliff. I started calculating exactly how deep the fall was going to be. News of my exclusion from the gala traveled the way bad news always does in our family. Swiftly, dressed up as polite concern. An aunt sent a message saying how sorry she was about the situation, before asking in the very next line if I had heard how much the catering was costing. A cousin sent a single crying emoji and nothing else. And then Audrey called, her voice dripping with the specific brand of pity she reserved for inflicting wounds. She said she wanted to ensure I understood that Mom was under an immense amount of stress, and that perhaps it was for the best if I sat this one out quietly. Then she delivered it, as casual as a weather report. You know how it is, Fiona. Mom just can't have her milestone celebration turned into a spectacle about her unstable single sister. There it was. Unstable. She wore our mother's vocabulary like a custom coat. I didn't take the bait. I told her I hoped the gala was everything they wanted, and I hung up before she could detect anything in my tone to carry back to the group chat. Silence, I had learned, is a currency my family never knew how to value. They mistook it for defeat every single time. But I wasn't defeating. I was doing what I do best when the accounts stop balancing. I stopped talking, and I started searching. That night, I opened a fresh ledger spreadsheet, the kind I'd constructed 1,000 times for corporate clients, and at the top, I entered a single name, Thorne. If you have ever been your family's unpaid labor, the one called to clean up the wreckage, but never deemed worthy of the portrait, stay with me. The receipts always find a way to the surface. Drop a comment with the word boundaries if you've had to draw your own line, and subscribe to their secret stories so you don't miss how this unfolds. On Saturday, Lily and I threw our own celebration. We drove out to the northern orchards, where the trees grew thick and golden in the late afternoon. We spread an old wool blanket that had belonged to my father, and we invited exactly 2 people. My lifelong friend Clara and her family. There was a plum tart I'd baked from scratch, slightly lopsided but sweet. And Lily raised her cup of juice to toast the rabbit. Clara's husband, Robert, joined us late, still wearing his office shirt. Robert was a senior loan officer at the community bank downtown. A decent man who had approved my first commercial account when no other institution would look at a new solo practice. He sat on the blanket, sharing quiet stories while the kids tossed pebbles into the grass. At one point, he asked gently how my mother was doing. I told him she was fine. He tilted his head, the way financial professionals do when they know something they shouldn't share. He let it drop. So did I. The afternoon was far too beautiful to waste on the thorns. Lily fell asleep in the passenger seat. On the drive home, orchard dust in her curls and purple sugar on her chin. I carried her inside, thinking, not for the first time, that I already possessed everything my mother's guest list was pretending to buy. A child who felt secure, a table where no one was judged, work I was proud of. My mother could have her Grandview Manor. I had the orchards, what I didn't know yet, driving under the rising stars, was that the quiet bank officer on my father's blanket had just become the second person in this story to see the shape of the storm before I did. And in less than a week, he would be the one to tell me it had a name. The first real fracture appeared through my office telephone. A wrong number and a sharp instinct converging all at once. A contractor called Thorn Advisory, looking for sterling development. Our numbers were 1 digit apart in the local directory, and he was 3 invoices past reasonable patience. He was an independent masonry contractor, tired, blunt, and he assumed I was Marcus's financial secretary. Before I could correct his mistake, he had revealed half the ledger. Marcus owed him 20,000 on the Blackwood Heights project. The development hadn't even broken ground. There was no ground. The purchasing option on the acreage had expired nearly a year ago. He'd heard Marcus was raising a new round of private funding, and he wanted his payment before the capital ran out. I let him finish. I told him I would ensure the message was delivered, which was true in a way he didn't expect. Then I hung up and sat in the silence of my office. Blackwood Heights wasn't a delayed development. It was an illusion. And my father's house had just been mortgaged to underwrite the next act. I didn't call Audrey. I didn't warn Tristan. I had no legal authority, no hard evidence. Nothing but a stranger's complaint and a misdirected phone call. And I knew from years of managing accounts that outrage without documentation is merely noise that holds no weight in a courtroom. So I opened the spreadsheet again, and I gave the contractor his own row. Date amount source. Then I began the slow, meticulous, unglamorous work that has brought down more fabrications than any shouting match ever could. I pulled the county registry records. I looked up the deed for the Blackwood Heights tract. There, in cold public record, was the truth the rest of the family had been too dazzled to inspect. The parcel Marcus swore he was developing belonged to the Regional State Park Conservancy and had for over 18 months. The figure at the bottom of my column finally had a name: fraud. Now that I was looking, the deception was visible everywhere, and the circle was closing. Marcus and Audrey spent the following week assuring the family that the development was already paying dividends, pointing to the lavish scale of the upcoming gala as proof of their prosperity. My mother contributed several thousand more for floral arrangements, because a woman only turns 70 once, and because spending capital is the loudest way to prove you still possess it. Then came the invitation I actually received. Audrey called to say that Mom wanted me to attend a private luncheon, just the women of the family, to put our differences behind us before the gala. I knew what a reconciliation luncheon meant. It wasn't an olive branch, it was a line cast into deep water. They wanted to discover what I knew, or they wanted to leverage my credit. And I wasn't certain which option was more dangerous. I went because Lily deserved a grandmother who made an effort, and because you always learn more at a table than you do by avoiding it. I sat with my fingers wrapped around a porcelain cup that cost more than my monthly heating utility, saying very little. My mother did the majority of the talking, and near the end, unsettled by my quietness, she let a figure slip. "It's not as if we're struggling," she said, her voice rising slightly. "The line is only at 60 of the 120. $120,000. A HELOC of $120,000 secured against a fully paid for ancestral home. Half of it already transferred into a subdivision that didn't exist." I set my cup down without making a sound. I thanked her for the lunch, and I drove home reciting the only kind of prayer I know, the kind that balances in perfect columns. I finally understood the depth of the crater, and I understood that no one in that family could see the bottom of it but me. 2 days after the luncheon, my mother did something she hadn't done in over a year. She sent a text asking if she could spend an hour with Lily. Just Lily, at the Botanical Conservatory near the library. Every protective instinct I possessed flared instantly. I answered with conditions. I would be present, seated on a nearby bench within clear view. Lily could go if she wished, and Lily, who forgives far more quickly than she should, wanted to go. So I watched from 30 feet away while my mother pointed out the orchids to my daughter. For that single hour, she looked less like a matriarch defending a throne and more like a woman I dimly remembered from my childhood. She laughed at something Lily said. She adjusted the collar of Lily's coat with a gentleness she had never once directed toward me. When she brought Lily back to my bench, she paused. For a brief second, she looked at my daughter, small, bright, entirely unburdened, and something shifted in her expression. "She isn't afraid of anything," my mother murmured, almost to herself. At her age, I was terrified of everything. I asked her what she had been terrified of. She opened her mouth, then closed it. "I was you once," she said, so quietly the wind almost took it. Then she straightened her spine, the familiar coldness returning to her shoulders, and the brief window slammed shut. She announced she would see me eventually and walked toward her car. I sat there holding Lily's warm hand, turning that single sentence over in my mind. I was you once. I didn't yet comprehend its meaning, but I filed it away in the registry of my memory. I would understand it 3 weeks later, in a room full of strangers, at the worst and most honest moment possible. Of course, she required a favor before she would offer a kind word. My mother needed my father's old storage unit cleared out, the one she had been paying rent on for 3 years without ever unlocking. She wanted the space gone, but couldn't bear the weight of the memories. Would I handle it? Of course I would. Part of me had been waiting for permission to stand in a room that still carried his scent. William Thorne had organized his life in precise, labeled crates. Clearing them was like tracing his thoughts one box at a time. His heavy boots, a jar of brass screws, the level he had used to frame the Blackwood Drive house, its green bubble still resting dead center after all these years. I worked for hours, sorting items to keep from those to donate, letting myself weep the quiet, necessary tears you shed for a father who was decent and gone. Near the back of the unit, beneath a dusty canvas tarp, I discovered his old drafting chest, and hidden underneath that chest was a small, heavy steel cash box I had never seen before, gray, dented, with a strip of weathered masking tape across the lid. On the tape, written in his blocky carpenter's print, was my name and nothing else. Fiona, not the family. Not Helena. Me. I sat down on an overturned crate, the box resting in my lap, my heart beating rapidly. My father had hidden something in the one location my mother would never bother to look, and he had labeled it for the one child she had dismissed. I shook it gently. A heavy slide of paper and something metallic shifted inside. It was locked, and search as I might through the chest and the unit, I couldn't find the key. I drove home with the steel box secured in the passenger seat. I didn't sleep that night because I knew my father, and William Thorne, never hid something that didn't carry immense weight. It took me 2 days to find the key, and I found it precisely where he would have expected me to look. It was taped inside the hollow case of his brass drawing compass, a spot only someone who had worked design beside him would think to check. William always said the critical detail always rests beneath the obvious one. I held the small iron key, but didn't open the box immediately. I was hesitant. The way you hesitate before opening a door, you can never close again. While I sat there finding my resolve, my phone buzzed with a message from Robert, the bank officer. The timing of it made the hair on my arms stand up. Fiona, it read. Not my place, and I'll deny I wrote this. But there is unusual title activity on your mother's estate. Tax liens are being registered. If she has an advisor, tell her to consult a real attorney this week, not next. I read the text 3 times. The 2 halves of my existence, the family drama and the financial ledgers, the hidden box on my table and the timber house on Blackwood Drive, had just converged. Whatever my father had locked away, and whatever Marcus had unleashed, they were about to collide. I sent Robert a single line of gratitude and kept the information to myself. Then I placed the key in the lock. My hands, which never wavered over multi-million-dollar audits, shook as I turned the iron key in that dented gray box. The mechanism released with a heavy, metallic click. Inside the box lay 2 items. A hand-written letter folded once, my name across the front in his blocky script, and beneath it, a thick sheaf of legal documents bound by a rusted steel clip. I read the letter first, wanting to hear his voice before I read the legal terms. Fiona, it began. You were always the one who counted the cost when everyone else was busy spending. Your brother squanders. Your sister pretends. Your mother, God preserve her, believes that if a structure looks grand from the road, the foundation must be solid. One day, that belief is going to cost her this home. When that day arrives, do not argue with her. You cannot win a debate with a woman defending her own vanity. Just keep the accounts straight, keep our girl safe, and let the documentation do the talking for you. I have placed the house where pride cannot touch it. You will know what to do because you always have. With love, Dad. I could barely read the legal pages through the tears, but I forced myself to review them. When I finished, the kitchen was entirely silent. My father had transferred the entire Blackwood Drive estate into an irrevocable family trust. It had not been left to my mother outright, as the family had assumed. It was held in trust with a specific covenant drawn up in the final year of his life. protecting the property from being leveraged or liquidated to satisfy the individual debts of any single family member. It named a sole trustee to preserve it for the next generation. For Lily, my mother held a life estate, meaning she could reside there until her death. But the property itself was locked inside the trust, and not a single timber could be mortgaged or sold without the express, written authorization of the trustee. And the sole trustee listed in his clear, block lettering was me, not Helena, which meant the $120,000 line of credit Marcus had secured against the house had been established without a shred of legal authority. The only person on earth who could authorize a lion on that property had never signed a single page. Sitting in that hospital ward years ago, running the arithmetic of his own family, my father had foreseen that vanity would eventually attempt to liquidate this house, and that I would be the only one left reading the fine print. I held his letter to my chest. Lily's voice echoed in my thoughts. Are we not real family? Yes, sweetheart. We were the only real thing he had left to protect, and he made sure of us before he departed. I want to be entirely transparent about the following morning. A different person might have driven straight to Blackwood Drive, tossed the trust documents onto the kitchen island, and finally won the argument. I didn't. My father had explicitly advised against it, and beyond that, I knew it would yield nothing. You cannot offer a proud woman a document and expect her to thank you for it. She will only perceive it as a weapon you've been sharpening in the dark. So, I opted for a different strategy, the slow, undeniable one. I chose documentation. I chose the cold, unyielding truth. Assembled brick by boring brick until it could stand in a room on its own without my anger to support it. She had declared that I chose to be an unstable single mother. Fine. I chose to keep our family's ledgers straight while they maintained their illusions. And now, those two decisions were about to collide. I began with the basics. I retrieved the recorded deed from the county archives and verified that the trust had been properly registered. It was fully active, my father's hand reaching up from the record vault to shield us. Next, I mapped the HLOC. The liens Robert had warned me about, the financial transfers, and the shell company Marcus used for Blackwood Heights. I compiled a professional audit folder, indexed and dated, the kind I wouldn't hesitate to present to a federal investigator. And near the bottom of the bank's loan file, hidden in the disclosures of the authorization form, I discovered the document that stopped my breath. A signature. My mother's name on a trustee certification dated April 14th. The bank had required this certification to verify she had the legal authority to encumber a property held in trust. The document swore she held sole trustee status. She had never held that status in her life, and she would never have knowingly signed a document claiming she did. I placed 3 of my mother's authentic signatures alongside the one on the April authorization. Helena's hand was distinctive. A grand sweeping H, the crossbar of her T always slashing upward to the right. Impatient and proud. The signature on Marcus's document was careful where she was free and hesitant where she was bold. It was an excellent imitation, but it was not her hand. Then I checked the date, because dates are where fabricators always stumble. And the date was what turned my stomach to ice. April 14th. I knew exactly where Helena Thorne had been on April 14th. because I had driven her there myself when Audrey claimed she was too busy. She had been at the regional medical center 90 miles away, undergoing advanced heart valve surgery. She had been under intensive monitoring. She couldn't have read a restaurant menu, let alone executed a legal transfer of authority. She had not signed that document. She physically could not have. Marcus had executed it for her. He had waited for the 1 week. She was functionally bedridden and completely dependent. And he had used her name to forge a key into my father's estate. And because that property rested inside my father's trust, and my mother was never its trustee, that single forged certification was the only document that had allowed the bank to register a lion against the house. Invalidate that single page, and the entire $120,000 claim dissolved into thin air. This was no longer a family dispute over a bad investment. This was felony forgery. It was grand fraud. In the plain language of the state statutes I'd spent years studying, it was a criminal offense. And the victim was a 70-year-old widow who had been too vain to let her daughter review her files, and too trusting of the polished son-in-law who had made himself her financial savior. I sat back. I felt no sense of victory. I felt only the cold, level clarity that comes when a ledger finally balances. I knew what he had done. I could prove it. And now I had to determine exactly how to handle a truth this heavy. I offered them one opportunity, not for their sake, but for Lily's. So that years from now, I could look my daughter in the eye and tell her I offered a doorway before I shattered the window. I met Audrey at a quiet cafe off the interstate, neutral ground, and laid the facts out plainly. I told her I knew about the $120,000 lien on Helena's house. I told her Blackwood Heights was a fiction. And I told her, watching her expression change, that the April authorization bore a signature our mother could not have written because she was in an operating theater 90 miles away. Tell her the truth before the bank contacts her, I said. Help me resolve this, and I will stand by both of you when the fallout begins. I mean it. For a fraction of a second, I detected the terror beneath her perfect exterior, the girl who had almost lost her florist business 4 years ago, and let me rescue her. Then the defense mechanism slammed shut. She called me envious. She called me a bitter, isolated woman trying to tear the family apart because I hadn't been invited to a birthday gala. And then she reached for the oldest weapon in her drawer. At least I'm not an unstable single mother, she sneered. Spying on other people's finances because she has nothing of her own. I didn't blink. I had heard that label so many times it had lost the power to draw blood. I looked at my sister, at the panic she was desperate to conceal with malice, and I felt nothing but pity. All right, I said, leaving cash on the table to cover both our coffees. You've chosen the hard way, Audrey. I'm going to let you walk it. I walked out into the afternoon parking lot, carrying a folder that could end her husband's career. I understood then that the gala 3 weeks away was no longer a celebration. It was a deadline. The default notice arrived at the Blackwood Drive house 11 days before the gala. It arrived without fanfare, a certified envelope containing a formal notice of default and an explicit warning that foreclosure proceedings on the property were imminent. Marcus had ceased making payments on the line of credit. The capital had vanished into a development that did not exist and the bank wanted their collateral. The collateral was my father's house. My mother called me at 7 in the morning. I barely recognized her voice. The pride was gone. She was weeping with the raw, ragged breath of a woman who has just watched the ground vanish beneath her feet. "They're taking the house, Fiona," she sobbed. "They sent a legal notice. Marcus won't return my calls. Audrey says it's an administrative error. Fiona, they're going to take your father's house." I stood in my kitchen, my father's letter still resting on the counter. I listened to her weep. I didn't say "I told you so," because there is no comfort in those words, and my father had asked me to let the truth do the work. What I felt was not triumph. It was grief, the old, familiar family weight. Everything he had constructed with his bare hands was about to be auctioned off to satisfy a lie told by a smiling man to my proud, terrified mother. She kept repeating my name into the receiver. The daughter she had excluded from her celebration was now the only person she could think to call. "What do I do?" she whispered. "Fiona, please tell me what to do." After a lifetime of being ignored, I was finally being asked. I closed my eyes. "Do not sign another document," I said. "Do not speak to Marcus. I am on my way." She came to my office that afternoon. A place she had never once visited in the 8 years I'd occupied it. She stood in the doorway of my single room above the bookstore, looking at the small radiator, the 3 client folders, and the credentials I had earned at a kitchen table. I watched her see it, perhaps for the very first time, as something real. She sat across from me, and when her pride finally broke open, the truth of our history came out. She spoke of her life when she was Lily's age, years my family never discussed, when William was away and funds were non-existent, and she had been, for a time, an unwed single mother in a community that offered no grace to women in her position. She spoke of how her own sisters, in law, had looked down on her, using that very same word at a family Christmas she had never forgotten. I swore when William established his firm and we finally built ourselves up, that no one would ever look at a thorn that way again, she said, her voice trembling. "And then you went and became the very thing I'd so hard to escape. Every time I looked at you, I saw that Christmas. I sat with that revelation. It explained everything, yet excused nothing. I let both of those realities exist at once. She wasn't a monster. She was a traumatized woman who had directed her pain at the wrong daughter and handed her security to the wrong man. But she still hadn't apologized. She had come for a rescue, not a reconciliation. I knew the difference. "I can save the estate, Mom," I said. "I can protect the house. But I am doing it for Dad and for Lily. And there are going to be conditions." She looked up, desperate. Anything. She had no concept of what she was agreeing to. I laid out my terms with professional precision, because warmth at that moment would have been a disservice, and my mother had already lived through enough falsehoods. Condition 1, complete financial transparency. Every account, every transaction, every password, and every document you have signed over the past 2 years. Condition 2, absolute silence toward Marcus. No calls, no messages, nothing he can manipulate. Condition 3, you will allow me to bring in the professionals I trust, and you will follow our instructions to the letter, without exception, and without attempting to protect anyone's feelings, including your own. And condition 4, I said, letting the words fall with absolute finality. When this is resolved, you will never again determine whether my daughter is real family. That vocabulary is permanently retired. Do we understand each other?" She gave a small, defeated nod. That afternoon, I made 2 telephone calls. The first was to Robert, who advised me on how to halt the immediate foreclosure and put me in touch with the bank's internal fraud division. The second was to Naomi, a forensic accountant I had trained with years ago, a woman who systematically dismantles financial predators for a living. By nightfall, my dining table had been converted into an audit headquarters. Colored tabs, detailed timelines, and my father's trust documents anchored the entire assembly. My mother sat in the corner, quietly watching her daughter work. For once, she offered no commentary, because she had finally realized the value of silence in a room where someone competent is saving her life. The gala was 10 days away. I intended to protect the house before the first guest arrived. I had no intention of protecting anyone's reputation. Naomi and I constructed the case over 9 days, working late into the night after Lily had gone to bed. We traced the flow of capital back to its source. It was undeniable once you knew where to look the $120,000 line of credit. The immediate transfers into an LLC controlled solely by Marcus and the lapsed option on the development tract. We matched the forged April authorization against the medical facility records Naomi had secured, placing my mother in an operating room 90 miles away on the exact day her signature was supposedly executed on a banking document. Motive means opportunity, and a paper trail a child could interpret. We presented the audit to the bank's fraud unit. The entire atmosphere of the conference room shifted the moment Naomi introduced the surgical records and the word forgery. A standard mortgage default is a collection issue. A forged financial instrument is a liability the bank must answer for. Suddenly, the representatives who had been eager to foreclose wanted to understand exactly how an unauthorized line of credit had been approved under their supervision. Their corporate counsel reviewed the recorded trust documents and turned visibly pale. A lion attached to trust property via a forged trustee certification was completely invalid. The bank now owned the discrepancy. By the end of the week, the legal department issued an official suspension of all foreclosure proceedings pending a full investigation and formally referred the forgery to the district attorney's office. During that same week, Naomi discovered something that made my stomach sink. Marcus had utilized the exact same strategy on 2 other families in the neighboring county, targeting retired widows, executing unauthorized secondary mortgages, and promising returns on fake developments. My mother wasn't his first victim. She was simply his most recent, which meant when this story broke, it wasn't going to remain a private family embarrassment. It was going to be a criminal trial. And Marcus Sterling had just RSVP'd to a gala where his mother-in-law's investigator knew every single detail of his crimes. Audrey realized the ground was shifting. She began calling my office, and when I refused to answer, she began calling our relatives. Within days, I was cast as the antagonist of the family, the jealous, bitter single mother bent on destroying our mother's milestone out of pure malice. She was highly skilled at narrative construction, and several of my aunts believed her because it was a far simpler story to accept than the truth. Then she took the step that dissolved whatever leniency I had left. She contacted my brother Tristan and, through him, sent a message that if I did not withdraw my investigation, they would ensure Lily was completely cut off from the family. They threatened that a young girl shouldn't grow up knowing her mother had ruined her grandmother's life. She used my child as leverage. She threatened an 8-year-old's sense of belonging to protect her husband's freedom. I have a long fuse, but that was the match. I didn't raise my voice. I did exactly what my father had instructed. I let the facts handle the argument. I called Audrey back, keeping the conversation brief and cold. "You will never use my daughter as a threat again," I said. "If you utter her name in another one of your campaigns, I will stop withholding the evidence that implicates you." Silence met my statement. She hadn't realized until that exact second that some of the documentation I held could implicate her as an accessory, and that I had been intentionally keeping her out of the filings. "Just wait until the gala," she spat, and terminated the call. She meant it as a threat. I took it as a location. 3 days before the event, the bank acted officially. The foreclosure was formally suspended, the forged documentation was flagged, and a legal team began the process of separating Helena, the victim of the fraud, from Marcus, the perpetrator. My father's house was being pulled back from the precipice, secured safely inside the trust, where it belonged. It was working. 9 days of meticulous auditing and late night coffee had undone the damage, precisely as I had promised. But my mother, true to her nature, had one final request. She begged me to keep the matter quiet until after her birthday celebration. The gala was already funded, the invitations were accepted, and she claimed she could not endure 70 people watching her play the fool at her own milestone event. "Let me have this one evening," she pleaded. "Then do whatever is necessary." I considered her request. I told her I would not initiate any conflict at the venue. I wasn't intending to perform a dramatic exposure, and I had no interest in public spectacles. But I also refused to compromise the truth. "I won't start the fire, Mom," I told her. "But if the truth enters that room on its own, I am not going to lie to protect the man who did this. Not even for an hour." She didn't care for the response, but she no longer held the standing to negotiate. The night before the gala, I sat on the edge of Lily's bed and asked her if she still wished to attend her grandmother's celebration. Because we were invited now. Helena, in her vulnerability, had quietly asked us to come, needing us there the way a drowning person needs a shoreline. Lily considered it carefully. "Yes." "Will Grandma be nice?" "Grandma is trying," I said. "And regardless of what happens, I will be right beside you." She decided she would go because she is braver than the rest of us, and because she wanted to wear her favorite dress with the pockets. I laid out her clothes, and then I prepared my own attire. A plain charcoal gray dress, the one I wear to formal client consultations. I was not going to that ballroom disguised as someone softer than I am. I packed my leather briefcase out of habit, placing my father's original trust documents and the completed audit folder inside. I didn't plan on using them, but I've carried a fire extinguisher into enough rooms to know you don't leave it in the vehicle just because you don't anticipate a fire. I turned off her light and stood in the quiet hallway of our modest genuine home. I thought of the chandeliers, the string quartet, and the man who would be raising a glass to his own cleverness. I didn't need to say a word. The facts were already waiting. The Grandview Manor Ballroom was exactly what wealth buys: massive crystal fixtures, a classical quartet performing in the corner, and 70 of the county's most prominent citizens in formal attire. My mother, dressed in emerald silk, moved through the crowd like a monarch pretending her crown wasn't slipping. I entered quietly, holding Lily's hand. The room noticed our arrival, a subtle murmur passing through the conversations. The excluded daughter had appeared. I didn't make an entrance. I found a small table near the back, got Lily a plate of hors d'oeuvres, and watched the room. Marcus was in his element, moving from table to table in an expensive tailored blazer. I realized, with a chill, what he was doing. He wasn't just celebrating, he was soliciting. The words Blackwood Heights drifted from multiple groups. He was using my mother's milestone celebration as a private pitch meeting, attempting to secure investment checks from the very people raising a glass to her health. The audacity of it was remarkable. He was going to defraud the guest list at the party funded by his deception. Across the room, standing near the bar in formal attire, was Robert, invited as a family friend, a loan officer who knew exactly what Marcus's development was worth. The entire situation was tilting toward a single point. I hadn't planned a public reckoning, but Marcus Sterling was about to strike a match in a room I had quietly filled with the truth. Marcus tapped his champagne flute with a silver fork, and the room grew quiet. He stepped up to the microphone beside my mother. He offered a smooth, polished toast to her 70 years, calling her the foundation of the family. Everyone raised their glasses, and I raised mine as well, because some of what he said was actually true. Then he pivoted to the sales pitch. He spoke of legacy, of building structures that endure. He announced that on such a milestone evening, it was only fitting to share an exclusive opportunity. Blackwood Heights, he declared, was breaking ground ahead of schedule, a once-in-a-generation development. And he wanted the people he respected most to have the opportunity to get in on the ground floor. He actually used the phrase limited availability. Glasses remained hovering near lips. Several of the local businessmen leaned in. Their interest peaked. And that was when Robert, standing near the bar, set his glass down on the marble counter and asked a single, clear question into the silence. Marcus, the tract on Route 9, that is the Blackwood Heights development, correct? Because our commercial department shows that title is registered to the State Park Conservancy and has been for over a year. The quartet had paused between selections. The question hung in the still air of the ballroom. Marcus's smile remained frozen, but his eyes darted toward the exit. Then, because the business community loves nothing more than verified figures, every face in that ballroom turned slowly toward the one person in the room known for keeping accurate records. They turned to me. My mother's oldest friend, Clara, spoke up from a nearby table, her tone almost gentle. Fiona, you managed the family accounts. Is the development real? I stood up. I didn't rush. I simply stood the way I do when asked a professional question in a room full of people who deserve an honest answer. Lily's hand slipped out of mine, and 70 pairs of eyes settled on me, the unstable single mother, the one who wasn't supposed to be present, now holding the floor at her mother's gala. I kept my voice flat, measured, and entirely calm, the tone I use to walk a client through a difficult audit. "You're asking for a professional assessment," I said, "so I will provide one. No, Blackwood Heights is not real. The option on the Route 9 parcel expired 14 months ago. The title remains with the Conservancy, as Robert noted. There is no ground to break." A low murmur rippled through the guests. I let it settle. "I am aware of this," I continued, "because when someone begins managing my mother's estate, I review the documentation, even when informed it is not my specialty. I will give you the plain numbers. A $120,000 line of credit was secured against my father's house. Those funds were immediately transferred into an LLC controlled solely by Marcus. And a bank certification dated April 14th bears my mother's signature, except my mother was in an operating room 90 miles away having heart surgery that morning. I drove her there myself. She could not have signed it. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning hum. I turned my gaze to my mother, whose custom emerald gown now looked entirely washed out under the crystal lights. "You informed this family that I chose to be an unstable single mother," I said, my voice carrying clearly to the back of the room. "I didn't. I chose to keep this family's foundation standing while everyone else chose to maintain appearances. That is the only difference between us." Audrey snapped first. She rose from her chair, shouting that I was a liar, an envious, malicious sibling attempting to ruin her family because I couldn't bear her success. But the more she screamed, the more the guests understood, because no one reacts with that level of panic to a claim they can easily disprove. She hurled the old insults. Unstable, single, desperate, but the words fell completely flat on the parquet floor, drained of their power at last. Marcus, meanwhile, was already calculating his exit. He set the microphone down, murmuring something about an administrative error and documents he could easily produce to clarify the situation. He began moving toward the doors. But Robert and another local businessman, one whose relative Marcus had targeted in the neighboring county, quietly stepped into his path, blocking the exit. The venue manager had already stepped into the foyer with his phone pressed to his ear. Marcus didn't run, because running is an admission of guilt. He stood in the center of the ruined celebration, offering hollow explanations, while Robert kept a firm shoulder between him and the door, informing him quietly that the district attorney's office would be contacting him shortly. I said nothing more. That was the entire point, the truth my father understood, and my sister never would. I stood in my plain gray dress and let the facts do the work. The illusion collapsed. The truth simply remained standing. 70 people watched my sister unravel and my brother in law shrink. And not one of them was watching me, because I had given them no performance to watch. Only numbers. Only calm. And that calm is what they would remember. Lily stood close to my side, entirely unafraid, observing everything. I placed my hand on her shoulder and waited, because there was still one person who hadn't spoken. The person this entire evening had been building toward. My mother. She walked toward me through the quiet of her ruined gala. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. I watched her try. I watched the woman who always had a sharp remark for every occasion, who had dismissed me in a family chat, stand before me with absolutely nothing to say. Perhaps she wanted to offer a defense, or an apology, or simply speak my name. But she found the drawer completely empty. Every appearance she had spent 70 years defending had just vanished, and the only things left standing in that ballroom were the house on Blackwood Drive and the daughter who had saved it. So I spoke for both of us, quietly enough that only the immediate tables could hear. I accounted for every cost in this family, Mom. Even the ones you pretended didn't exist. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. She couldn't. For the first time in my life, my mother had no words for me, and I understood, standing there, that this was the closest thing to justice I would ever receive, and it was entirely sufficient. Then Lily, holding my hand, looked up at the stunned, wealthy faces, at her grandmother, at her weeping aunt, and spoke with the absolute clarity of a child who understands the only math that matters. We are real family. We're the ones who stayed. There was no applause, no music. It wasn't that kind of moment. I lifted my daughter onto my hip, and in the middle of that ruined country club ballroom, I felt, for the first time in my life, that I was exactly where I belong. The remaining details unfolded in the language of legal consequences. The only language that carries permanent weight. The bank's investigation proceeded exactly as expected. Marcus's forged authorization, verified against the surgical records, left him with no defense. He is answering for his actions now. Not just for our family, but for the other victims in the neighboring county, in a courtroom rather than a country club. Audrey's polished presentation is gone. Along with the marriage she had been holding together with fabrications and my mother's capital. The house on Blackwood Drive was successfully secured inside the trust, held safely for Lily. Exactly as my father had intended. I didn't take a victory lap. I drove my daughter home that evening through the quiet valley, tucked her into bed, and sat for a long time at my kitchen table with my father's letter. My mother kept her home, but she lost her throne. And perhaps, in the complicated arithmetic of pride, she is finally free of the weight of it. We speak occasionally now, cautiously and entirely on my terms. She has not used the word unstable since. She wouldn't dare. And when she looks at Lily now, there is a quiet respect in her eyes. The kind of respect she never offered to me. I'll accept it. Not because I have forgotten the past, but because I would rather my daughter grow up watching me maintain a boundary than watching me nurse a grudge. Here is the only wisdom I have gathered, and it fits into a single thought. Respect is not something you debate at a family dinner table. It is something you quietly record in the ledger of how you allow people to treat your child. I stopped waiting to be chosen a long time ago. What I never stopped doing was keeping our books straight and keeping my daughter safe. In the end, those quiet habits outlasted every loud opinion my family ever held about who I was. They called me the unstable single mother. It turned out that was simply their term for a woman they couldn't control. And single was simply their term for a woman who had already chosen her real family, and chosen correctly. That is how the quiet investigator kept the house standing. Remember this: when someone attempts to measure your value by your status, establish your boundaries, preserve your receipts, and protect your children first. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Tell me in the comments where you drew your line and subscribe to their secret stories, where the quiet ones always keep the better records.